We're going to open it up to the floor in just a moment here, but always an academic, I want to ask the panel a question to think about. So I'm going to ask you all if you can just toss this around. We've called this evening, "Is This My Beautiful Life?" And clearly so many of us have lived a life full of loss, yet loss also of survival. Right? Paz, neg, men, women. I think of my colleague, my friend Nancy, who sits next to me every day at NYU. We came of age at the same time in New York City, and our experience is so defined by this epidemic. She grew up in the village, and I grew up with the Greeks in Astoria, but our city life defined us. And I ask you, in thinking about this life of loss and survival, how do we, as we emerge into middle age and these later stages of our lives, how do we reconcile this, and how do we make sense of it, and what do we bring to the table to make the most of these life experiences that will then take us forward for the next, let's say, 50 years?
Now we're silent.
Well, I can share my experience. I also realized that I've been totally isolated. I started an organization on my own, with a group of friends. But what that did is that I was able to create my own philosophy on life. What is it to live with HIV? And so this is very personal. And what I do at A4H is basically what I have done with my life. And I'm very pragmatic, and I think the pragmatism came from my early 20s, losing friends, so I'm not very emotional. And I think I lost that in my 20s, but I found happiness with what I did. One of the reasons I stopped talking about my personal experience with HIV is because I hate when people said, "Oh, you do AIDS work because of your own experience." And that was kind of true then, but I found who I am with what I do. I don't think I work. I truly believe in social change, and I believe that if I'm okay with myself, I can make somebody else happy. So it became my own reality. So that's why I'm so excited to hear other people's experience, because being isolated is no good either. And so, I do have a beautiful life. I'm going to be a father in November. And so when I was 20, I didn't think I was going to make it to 25. When I was 25, I didn't think I was going to make it to 30. I'm 45 now, and again, it became very personal. When I came to New York, I really love New York. I think I'm rooted in New York. I'm a New Yorker with a Latin accent. I remember I was in a meeting on an AIDS conference, and when you get out of New York, I would never say I'm from Venezuela, I'd say I'm from New York. And so, somebody from New York said, "You're not from New York?" I said, "Okay." And now that, I'm having a baby, it's like, well, I guess I will be from New York. So I developed my own beautiful life, and it worked for me. I don't think there is an answer. I think the answer is within us, and it sounds really corny. It's very, very corny, but it became my truth.
Well, I don't want to, I don't want the panel to be all about resilience. I've been hearing a lot of, I have a lot of shrinks that are friends for some reason. And all of them are telling me that they're seeing pretty extraordinary levels of suicide in our age group, among gay men specifically. And I don't know if that is something we're experiencing at higher rates than men in general. I don't know the science behind that. I just saw a story on NBC News last week with our former health director from New York City, Tom Frieden, the head of the CDC, reporting a shocking rise of suicide rates among middle-aged Americans, just a huge increase, 30, 40% in the last 10 years. So is what we're seeing in gay men just following that trend, or are we more damaged? I do know we have higher levels of addiction. I've been there. Spencer was there. I just feel strongly that the community is not looking at these issues anymore. That we used to be a community about our health, and now we're a community just solely focused on equality. And we're missing the health portion. We're really missing the health portion, especially with HIV. You know, Ron Stahl's studies are pretty solid, showing that current infection rates among college students and gay men of college age, that 50% of them will be positive by the time they're 50, over 50%.
And 50% of men of color by the time they're 35.
Right. And that matches kind of what happened to my generation. According to CDC data, over 30% of gay men in their 50s are HIV positive. It would be 50% if more of us had survived. So we're making no progress. We're not dying in the rates we used to, but we're silent about this now, and I feel abandoned. And I think that plays out in the lives of many of my friends in various ways. I don't know whether our resilience outweighs that on average, and we're, you know, if you compare us to a cohort of gay men who were largely, you know, lived somewhere that just didn't have much of an AIDS crisis. I don't know where they were, but you know, there must be a cohort out there that didn't really get impacted by the plague years. Are we worse off or better than they're doing? We don't know the answer to that question. So,
your opening remarks were about resilience, and now you've turned it around. Mine were kind of a downer, so I will turn it around here and say, I think all of us that had to deal with the plague years discovered in ourselves a skill set that we never knew we had. We were and certainly those of us in ACT UP were just forced out into an arena and out into the street often, and found courage, but very particular skills. I mentioned learning to shave my good friend Brian. I've recently come off of caring for my 92-year-old father who recently died. I was his primary caregiver, and he was homebound for the last 5 years of his life. I shaved him every week for 4 years, and it was the highlight of his week. But that was a very particular and at times difficult but tender skill that I had learned. And I think a whole generation of us had to learn caregiving skills a generation before we had to, and now a generation later, I've used them with both of my parents. I am very encouraged by the last year within the ACT UP cohort. The 2 films about ACT UP, the 25th anniversary about ACT UP, and the ACT UP alumni Facebook page have all drawn a lot of us activists together that had drifted apart, sometimes quite literally for decades. And so I'm kind of encouraged because a lot of us who have got together have realized among ourselves that we were all carrying a great burden. And in some ways, we've started our group therapy. and are sharing that burden. But it's what do I want to say? I've discovered an awful lot of resilience there, and I mentioned, and Peter mentioned, this ACT UP non-reunion that's going to be taking place on the 22nd. There are still a lot of amazing people, and they all are more amazing now, and they have all in their ways, I think, had beautiful lives, and I think a lot of them have had a lot of grief and sadness in their life, but I really do think they've all developed an awful lot of skills that they are all still using with the people in their lives all these years later.
I'd like to pick up on something Peter was talking about in terms of these rates of suicide and depression. We really don't know, and that's part of the problem. My friend and colleague Steve Karpiak at Korea likes to always say, it's the numbers, stupid. Really what we're seeing in terms of HIV infection among gay and bisexual men is a reflection of these larger health disparities that everybody in the LGBT community faces, whether you're positive or negative. And we don't have the information. I've been working with colleagues trying to get questions on sexual and gender identity added to these national health surveys so we start to get some of this information. And this is the response we get. One, oh, we can't ask people this question because they'll be too offended, okay? Two, we don't need to ask questions about that unless it's a survey about sex, all right? So all the activism we've been able to bring to the marriage equality fight, if we want to have a beautiful life as we're getting older, we need to bring to this fight to address these larger health disparities and often economic disparities that our community faces. And I think we have the political organization now. It's just a matter of the will to make that happen.
You know, is this my beautiful life? I can tell you my day job was being a doctor at Harlem Hospital. My night job was going to take care of friends who were dying from AIDS and sometimes colleagues. And so as a physician, I gained a wealth of understanding of what it's like to take food to people who don't want to eat it, to turn them, to bathe them, to shave them, to do all of those things. And so, you know, how do we survive? There is resilience, and it comes in many, many different ways. And I have found that I used to be very angry about AIDS, and I used to be very just angry, just pissed off because of everything. But I find that in moving into my middle-aged years, as a survivor of the crisis, that HIV is my constant companion, and I finally had to accept that. And I finally had to understand that for me, my resilience comes from thinking back to all of my wonderful friends and thinking about all the things that I learned. But it took me many, many years to be able to even think about what I had been through. And so when we talk of resilience and beautiful life, we want to be here a long time. And at some point, we have to dig deep inside. I agree, Jim. There's skills that we learn along the way, almost without thinking about it, about how to be resilient and how to share that with others who are struggling to be resilient.
What came to mind when Peter was mentioning whether or not or why depression and suicide appears to be rising or more highly represented among our age group. It's always been my feeling that you know, there's a sort of natural life cycle that gay men have in public social life traditionally. You know, you have your clubbing years, and then you move into your bar years, and then you move into your cocktail lounge years, and then you move into your piano bar years. And if you're in Fort Lauderdale, then you end up at through it all, the frequency in which you're out in public, you know, just tends to decrease overall, no matter where you are. And most gay men, you know, in those times of their lives when they're less out on, so to speak, on the prowl, less out there hitting the clubs, you know, their socializing historically has been with their lifelong friends, with the people that they did all those things with all those years. And so now we have men in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who, through that natural cycle I described, you know, have largely withdrawn from the public social scene. They don't really have that many peers left to share a private social life with anymore. I have friends in Lauderdale and San Francisco and here in New York who tell me that, you know, if they don't go out to bars, they don't see anybody because there's nobody left. You know, I've got stories that I can tell that, you know, there were 20 people in the story and I'm the only one alive to know the story. Of course, I always come out really good in the stories, so there's no one to discount the way I tell it. That's the famous gallows humor of the people on this panel. But the saving thing about what we were just talking about, I believe it or not, is the internet. Because, you know, while, you know, you may not have the interest or the desire or the ability even, or the access to have a public social life anymore when you're in your 40s, 50s, and 60s and up, you can draw real virtual support on the internet, and I think that that's where our focus almost, you know, by default has to be. You know, there's a lot of talk about getting together the old-timers, reunions, and those things are all great, but those aren't available to more than a few people outside of more than a very few cities. So I think as we continue to address depression and loneliness and solitude, you know, among the aging AIDS group, the internet really, I can see no other places where we should put our attention.
I would like to follow up on a point that Mark made. Some of you know that I have recently gone back to ACT UP after 20 years of being away because I was personally so... Save it. Until we do something, at least. I was drawn back because I was very frightened by the CDC's estimates of new transmission among young gay men in particular. Because when you break the recent statistics, the latest we've got, came out last November, and if you break it down between 2008 and 2010, HIV infection spiked among gay men by 12%, even as it dropped among everyone else that they measured it for by 15%. And again, if you break it out in those statistics, if I were a young African-American gay man, I was 6 times more likely to become infected than a white gay man. And if I were a gay man of any race, I was 30 times more likely than a straight guy of the same age. Those statistics boggle me, but what boggled me more was a point Mark made. When it comes to sex and sexuality, and particularly gay sexuality or anal sex, our data are lousy. And I think until we get people out there agitating for really good research with respect to sex and prevention and all those things that the right wing in this country would like us to shut up about, we're not even going to know what we can do to begin to stem what will be a wider wave of HIV than we have ever seen yet. Admittedly, at a time when our drugs are a lot better to take care of it. And so I just hope that we can light a fire under Gay Inc. and our community at large and get perhaps those of us who went through the plague years to get out there in solidarity with a young generation and actually agitate again for the kind of research and dollars that we really will need, because we're getting hit with this wave at a time when it's really queasy out there in the healthcare system. We have budget cuts at federal, state, and local level. We have sequestration. We have so much uncertainty about reauthorization of Ryan Care, when we know that a lot of the healthcare delivery along the continuum is dependent on the Ryan Care Health Act, and we don't even know if it's going to get reauthorized. And we have Obamacare coming in, and it's going to help us in some ways, but there is so much question. So I have an awful lot of queasiness, and maybe I'm trying to light a fire so that there will be maybe a new generation of AIDS activism, because I honestly think we could use one right now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. I mean, I know personally that I will remember tonight as one of the most beautiful times of my life. So I thank our panelists again for being here with us.